the satisfying downfall of every major dictator. When you talk about some of the most evil dictators in all of modern history, most people reasonably focus on their crimes against humanity. However, people typically forget to mention exactly how these people were brought to justice or how they got away with it. And in this video, we're going to discuss exactly how every major dictator lost either their power or, in most cases, their life. Let's begin. Kim Jong-il. In 1994, Kim Jong-il became the ruler of North Korea when his father passed away. And what Kim Jong-il inherited from his father was a communist nation that was run with an iron fist, completely isolated from any outside sources, repressive in almost every sense of the word, and riddled with human rights violations. And Kim Jong-il gladly took this country and continued the tradition. And like any wild dictator, of course, he gave himself a crazy title. In this case, Kim Jong-il was the supreme leader of North Korea. Due to how secretive North Korea is, there's actually not much known about Kim Jong-il's early life, although it's speculated that he was born in 1941 on a Soviet military base near the Russia-North Korean border because that's where his father was stationed at the time. However, when Kim Jong-il became the supreme leader of North Korea, a lot of interesting facts were presented by the North Korean government about their new leader's past. Specifically, that he was born on February 16th, 1942, on top of North Korea's sacred Mount Pictu. But not only that he was born on top of this mountain, but when he was born, a new star appeared in the sky and a double rainbow appeared overhead. That claim alone is crazy, and keep in mind, this isn't hyperbole or metaphorical. They present this information as fact, and the North Korean citizens are meant to believe it. And even if they don't believe it, they better act like they believe it. But besides the crazy claims about his birth, there's also an endless supply of crazy claims around his achievements in his life. One of my favorites being that he made 11 holes in one in a single round of golf. Another being that he composed operas popular in China, and also that he invented an invisible cell phone and that he could literally control the weather. I feel bad for the North Korean citizens that blindly fell for all of this obvious propaganda, but I almost feel worse for those who saw through the propaganda and had to believe in a world that they knew was fake and there was nothing they could do about it. At least if you believed it, you were blissfully ignorant to the truth. Regardless, after Kim Jong-il grew to power, only a few years after Kim Jong-il was given power of all of North Korea, he was responsible for a series of famines that killed an estimated 2 million people from 1994 until 2000. And that is really only the beginning of the human rights violations that happened in North Korea during his supreme rule. But things started to change in the late 2000s, when Kim Jong-il was not seen in public places, specifically in the 2008 Olympics or in military demonstrations where he was always attending. Other countries started to suspect that Kim Jong-il was beginning to be in poor health or potentially even already dead, although the North Korean state media made it seem like everything was just fine and dandy. That was until December 17th, 2011, when Kim Jong-il was confirmed dead by the North Korean government. The North Korean government claimed that he died of overexertion because he was simply working so hard, making North Korea the best it could be for the people. But in reality, he likely just passed away from a heart attack. And following his death, there was a mandatory 11-day mourning period where everybody had to publicly look upset about the death. And Kim Jong-il's body was even placed on public display in a memorial palace in Pyongyang. This is the same palace where his father's body is also on permanent display. Following his death, his youngest son, Kim Jong-un, was given total control of this dictatorial regime. And as of today, he's still in power. But maybe in a future video, we can discuss his downfall as well. Hideki Tojo. Hideki was born and raised deep within the grips of imperialistic Japan. He was born in 1884 and began his education at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, and then began his career in the Imperial Japanese Army in 1905. After spending time in the Japanese Army, he served as the military attaché in Germany, of all places, from 1919 until 1922. And from that point, over the next 15 to 20 years, he began quickly rising through the ranks of the Japanese military and Japanese government until October of 1941, when he was appointed the Prime Minister of Japan. Now, under a different context, that may seem like an impressive military and political career. However, the actions that took place under this man's rule is anything but impressive, and is truly nothing short of a nightmare. Hideki was the Prime Minister of Japan from 1941 until 1944 when, well, we'll get to that. And if you couldn't already tell, that was during the Second World War. And if you know anything about World War II in Japan, well, they weren't up to much good stuff. And some of the things attributed to Hideki's rule are the following: numerous war crimes, including the massacre and starvation of thousands of of prisoners of war and millions of innocent civilians, the attack that happened on Pearl Harbor, which literally happened 2 months after he was appointed prime minister, and other numerous mass murders that happened in and out of Japan during his rule. And not to mention, before he was even prime minister, but still an extremely highly ranking military official, the whole Japanese invasion of China in 1937 happened, and that's a completely different can of worms, but just know that that was literally hell on earth as well. It's safe to say that a genocidal, military appointed prime minister is really nothing short of a dictator. And even if you don't specifically classify him as a dictator, well, his resume doesn't make him any better than one. And on July 18th of 1944, Hideki actually resigned as prime minister, as the war was definitely not going Japan's way. After he resigned, Japan surrendered to the Allied powers, and in September of 1945, Hideki was arrested. Following his arrest, he was put on trials in an international tribunal military court, where he was sentenced to death for numerous crimes against humanity and numerous war crimes. And on December 23rd, 1948, only 2 days before Christmas, Hideki was hung. And his reign of terror was over, but definitely not forgotten. Pol Pot. In the 1960s, in the Cambodian jungle, Pol Pot began to organize the Khmer Rouge, a group that advocated for a radical communist revolution to essentially wipe out any form of Western influence in Cambodia. In 1970, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge troops, along with North Vietnamese troops, began a large-scale insurgency against the Cambodian government. And through this insurgency, they were able to control a third of the entire country. And by April of 1975, only 5 years later, Khmer Rouge was able to capture the capital of Cambodia, overthrow the pro-US regime, and establish a new government, the Kampuchean People's Republic. Once Pol Pot was fully in power of Cambodia, the cities were evacuated, schools and factories were closed, and any form of private property or currency was abolished. And terrifyingly, anybody who is believed to be intellectual, such as somebody who was proficient in math or potentially spoke a foreign language, was immediately killed. Even if you were good at your job, just a skilled worker, you were also killed. But even if you weren't speaking other languages or particularly good at your job, if you even had any form of basic technology, such as glasses, a watch, or even maybe a little radio, you were once again killed. And because of this, from 1975 to 1978, it's estimated that over 2 million Cambodian people were killed by either execution or forced labor or famine. But in 1978 to 1979, Vietnamese troops were back in Cambodia, but this time to overthrow the Khmer Rouge because they saw how crazy things have gotten. And in 1979, Pol Pot and the remaining Khmer Rouge members retreated back into the Cambodian jungle. In 1985, Pol Pot officially retired from being the head of the Khmer Rouge, even though it was already at this point no longer controlling Cambodia and more or less of a entity that just existed in Cambodia. But even still, after his retirement, the Khmer Rouge still continued to take out guerrilla actions against the Cambodian government. But in 1997, Pol Pot was finally put on trial, and he was sentenced not to death, but to life in prison. And if you're not already upset, this is where things get really upsetting, because although so many people wanted him to be extradited and sentenced to death, he not only just got life in prison, but he was also able to serve time in his home on house arrest. And a year after his trial in 1998, Pol Pot declared in an interview that, quote, "My conscience is clear." And later that year, he died in his home, peacefully in his sleep. Life is truly unfair. Some of the best people in the world are gone too soon in horrific ways. And others, who kill millions of their own people, get to live long lives and die peacefully in their sleep. Sometimes you just feel like justice truly wasn't served. Benito Mussolini. World War II is going to be a common theme in this video because, unfortunately, there was an abundance of dictators, but I'm going to sprinkle them throughout so it's not all at once. Early in Mussolini's career, he was a socialist politician and a journalist at a newspaper. And in 1912, he became a member of the National Directorate of the Italian Socialist Party, but was actually kicked out of that because he wanted military intervention in World War I. Because of this, in 1914, Mussolini founded his own newspaper and also served in the Royal Italian Army until he was wounded and discharged in 1917. After being removed from both political and military groups, he decided that the best next course of action was to start his own thing. And what he started was a fascist movement in Italy. In 1922, following the March on Rome, he was appointed as the prime minister by King Victor Emmanuel III. And shortly after becoming the non-elected prime minister of a country, Mussolini, through the help of his secret police and his followers, were able to consolidate all of their power, transforming Italy into a one-party dictatorship. Within 5 years of being the appointed prime minister, Mussolini was able to establish a dictatorial authority by both illegal and legal means. And his goal was to create a totalitarian state. And if you're unfamiliar, totalitarianism is essentially just a political system that literally prohibits the opposition of the government, meaning that the government controls and owns everything and you cannot say anything about it. From his rise to power in 1922 to 1937, there was multiple wars and conflicts that Italy was involved in due to their new political structure. And in 1937, after the huge costs of all of the conflicts that they were involved in, they decided to preemptively join the Axis powers, specifically Germany and Japan. And this ended up being extremely helpful for Italy because they were completely unprepared for World War II. In July of 1943, when the Allied powers invaded Sicily, King Victor Emmanuel III, the person who initially appointed Mussolini, was now dethroning Mussolini, and didn't only take his power, but also put him in custody. But it didn't last long, as Germany was able to successfully rescue Mussolini, and Mustache Man from Germany made Mussolini a ruler of a not-so-official puppet state that was just a German-occupied part of northern Italy, which was known as the Italian Social Republic. But when Germany and Italy and the Axis powers began to fall, and it was obvious that the Axis powers were no longer going to win World War II, Mussolini and his mistress at the time attempted to fully flee Italy and go to Switzerland to essentially go into hiding. While en route to Switzerland, the pair stopped near Lake Como with a group of other fascists and German soldiers, basically right on the border of Switzerland. During this brief break on their escape, Mussolini was actually trying to be incognito, and how he did so was by dressing up as a German soldier, which, you know, you're a bad guy if you're disguised as a German soldier. But even with this disguise, it didn't help him, because Italian partisans saw him and killed him and his girlfriend essentially on sight. They recognized him, and at that point, Mussolini no longer existed. Nicolae Ceausescu. Born in 1918, Nicolae was born to be a politician. As a child, he was a member of the Romanian Communist Youth Movement, and as a young adult, he found himself rising through the ranks of the Romanian Communist Party. And when the previous leader of that communist government died in 1965, Nicolae was handed the torch, and he became the Romanian Communist Party General Secretary. And from being declared General Secretary in 1965, he was able to gain power, and in 1974, only 9 years later, declare himself as the Romanian president, which essentially gave him total control of the entire country of Romania. When somebody grants themselves total control of an entire country, it's not hard to believe that they would start easing in things like censorship of the press and totalitarian rule, something we discussed earlier. And it got so bad that at the time it was considered one of the most repressive governments in all of Europe. Nicolae had secret police that were responsible for mass surveillance and even mass repression of human rights abuses that were happening in the country. And because of his censorship of the press, a lot of the things that were going on within the country were not able to be spread within or outside of the country either. There was a time when Nicolae was actually popular, although his popularity was extremely brief and unstable. And during the late 1970s, while he was the president, his mismanagement led to massive debts for the country of Romania. And in 1982, Nicolae forced the Romanian government to export way too much of the country's agricultural resources in order to help pay these debts, which obviously put pressure on the citizens of Romania. Fast forward to 1989, only 7 years later, anti-government protesters are popping up all over the place. And Nicolae saw these demonstrations as a political threat and ordered the military to open fire on these demonstrators, resulting in multiple deaths and injuries. And because of this action, the people could no longer take it, and massive, widespread rioting and civil unrest roared across the entire country of Romania and sparked the Romanian Revolution. It got to the point where demonstrators were breaking into the Capitol building of Romania, and Nicolae and his wife fled from the roof of the building on a helicopter, although the military forced them to land, and they were arrested, tried, and convicted of economic sabotage and genocide. And the couple were sentenced to death immediately, and both Nicolae and his wife were executed via a firing squad on Christmas Day, 1989. Joseph Stalin. Stalin was born to a poor Georgian family in the Russian Empire, and as a young adult joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, while at the same time he was also helping raise funds for Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction, and how he was donating to this faction was actually by committing bank robberies and other crimes, as well as editing the party's newspaper. Already off to a good start. Because of his crimes, he was repeatedly arrested, where he was exiled to Serbia multiple times. After the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, Stalin served as a member of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Very quick and easy name. And from 1922 onward, he used his position as General Secretary to gain control over the entire party. After Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, Stalin was the new man in charge. And Stalin's doctrine of socialism in one country became central to the party's ideology. And while he was now in power and had grand plans for the Soviet Union, it didn't really work out in his favor, because due to his poor policies, natural disasters, increased demand for food because of urbanization caused by his poor policy, a nationwide famine took place from 1932 till 1933 and killed millions of people in the Soviet Union. But that's not all. Only 3 years later, between 1936 and 1938, Stalin executed hundreds of thousands of confirmed and potential political opponents in what was called the Great Purge. And on top of that, under his regime, an estimated 18 million people were processed through the Gulag system of forced labor camps, which was essentially hell on earth. Keep in mind, all of this took place after after World War I and before World War II. Of course, then World War II happens, which is an entirely separate can of worms, which is beyond the scope of this video at this point. But to put it in short, after World War II, the dust had settled and people were happy that, the Axis powers were defeated, but there was still one issue. Western countries wanted capitalism, and the Soviet Union did not, which obviously eventually led to the Cold War, but during this time led to a lot of unease surrounding how things were going to be rebuilt post-World War II. One thing that the Soviet Union decided to do was to build their own nuclear bomb, which they tested in 1949. But unfortunately, during the same year, the country was also experiencing another famine. And on top of that, they also had a state-enforced campaign that killed both Jewish people and intelligent people called the Doctor's Plot. But here's the thing, despite all of the things I mentioned, specifically within the Soviet Union, Stalin was seen in a relatively positive light. He had a cult of personality, he led the Marxist-Leninist movement, and by his followers, he seemed to be the champion of socialism and the man of the working class, although millions of them died. Regardless, at the time, Stalin was relatively popular, and even to this day, in post-Soviet countries, there are old people that still remember times before the Soviet Union fell, where they look at those times fondly, and they miss those times, and they wish that the Soviet Union was reestablished, which is unfortunate because a lot of the countries that are now post-Soviet are riddled with corruption, not allowing them to actually prosper in a capitalistic society. But that's completely beyond the scope of this video. Joseph Stalin died at the age of 74 on March 5th, 1953. He passed away in his personal residence after suffering a stroke. But even though he was now dead, mass murders caused by him didn't stop. What I mean is, following Stalin's death, there was massive funeral celebrations that took place. Like I mentioned, he was relatively popular within the Soviet Union, and because of this, hundreds of thousands of people attended his multi-day funeral. And unfortunately, because of people being so excited or simply so cramped and a lack of fire regulation, at least 109 people were confirmed to have been killed in a crowd crush that took place at the funerals, and it's estimated that it's completely possible that over 1,000 people in total died because of the funeral services that took place. This is one of the more interesting situations we've talked about so far, because at this point, no other dictator was still fully in control and still relatively popular at the time of their death. Up until Stalin, every other dictator either had to go into hiding to die peacefully or was executed. So this one was interesting. What else is interesting is the fact that I post videos every week. Feel free to subscribe. Let's move on. Saddam Hussein. We actually already discussed Saddam Hussein 2 videos ago in our video about bad people that did good things, but in this video, we're not going to discuss any of his good deeds at all. As an adolescent, Saddam attended a nationalistic high school in Baghdad, and after high school, Saddam studied at an Iraqi law school for 3 years when he dropped out in 1957. At that point, he joined the Pan-Arab Ba'ath Party, basically the Iraqi regional branch of the Arab Socialist Party. Interestingly, during his rise to power, Saddam was actually involved in an assassination conspiracy to kill Qasim al-Rashid, who opposed the notion of Pan-Arabism. Although during the assassination attempt, Saddam, who was supposed to provide cover to the other shooters, actually began shooting first, which ended up disorganizing the entire operation, and the person they were trying to assassinate was only hit in the arm and survived. Interestingly, although this assassination attempt was failed, the party that Saddam was a part of, which only had less than 1,000 members, was now gaining widespread coverage and attention because of the attempt. But interestingly, this wasn't necessarily bad publicity. It didn't stop his future political career at all. And he spent the following years in jail, conniving with other small political groups, theorizing other assassination attempts, and ultimately participating in coups. Which brings us to the late 1960s and early 1970s, when Saddam has built himself a reputation of being a progressive and effective politician. And because of this, he found himself becoming the vice president. And he was vice president during the 1973 energy crisis that saw oil prices skyrocketing, which directly benefited Iraq because they were, of course, selling that oil. And with this extra revenue, they were able to help revitalize and strengthen Iraq, pulling people out of poverty and developing and industrializing the country. But of course, his time as vice president and as president is not without its many, many flaws. For example, the use of mustard gas and nerve gas on innocent civilians, which resulted in thousands and thousands of deaths. The Dujal massacre, which took place in 1982 under his rule, which resulted in the execution of 148 men and boys. And on top of both of these things, just general blatant disregard for international law and numerous violations of international borders, some of which were actually subsidized by other countries because Iraq was dealing with the Iranians and Kuwait. Some countries kind of overlooked the war crimes of chemical warfare to help support Iraq because they were fighting with Iran. And by countries that were supporting this, I mean the United States and the United Kingdom. Throughout the entirety of his rule, the divide in Iraq was massive. Some people seeing him as a hero and a great leader, others seeing him as a horrible dictator, and it really all depended on what tribe you belonged to. But in March of 2003, the US invaded Iraq, ending his nearly 24-year regime, which was at this point internationally known for repression, brutal purges, and massive violence used to maintain absolute power. Just classic dictator stuff. And during this US invasion in the fall of Baghdad in 2003, Saddam Hussein went into hiding, but he was caught only a few months later when US forces found an underground bunker. After Saddam was captured, he was held in the States and then transferred back to Iraq, where he was put on trial for a lot of the crimes he committed as president, specifically the attack I mentioned in 1982. This trial ended on November 5th, 2006, and Saddam was found guilty and was sentenced to death by hanging. And interestingly, this hanging took place during the Islamic holiday of Eid, which is odd because we also discussed an execution that happened earlier that took place on Christmas. I'm not sure if that's just how the dates lined up or if that was intentional, but regardless, it happened. And a video was actually taken of the execution by somebody who recorded it on their cell phone. And this video was leaked and widespread online and on the news. And as I mentioned, depending on who you were, this execution was seen as justice finally being served or a massive injustice, all depending on what you believed and which tribe you belonged to. Interestingly, Saddam actually requested and tried hard to be executed via firing squad, but in court, that request was denied and he was obviously hung. Adolf Hitler. Once again, and for the last time, we are back in World War II. Likely one of the most notorious people to come out of the entire World War. The rise of Hitler is likely one of the most well-known and well-talked about of all of the people on this list. So for that reason, I'll keep it brief. Interestingly, unlike basically everybody we've talked about in this video, Hitler was not born in the country that he ended up ruling. Hitler was born in Austria, not Germany. Although being born and living very close to the German border, he felt a very strong sense of German patriotism. And also, interestingly, unlike almost everybody else in this list, Hitler wasn't instantly indoctrinated into politics as a young person. He actually spent his childhood and young adulthood in the arts, not in politics. As an 8-year-old child, he took singing lessons and attended a choir, and at that point, even considered becoming a priest. Just imagine if Hitler ended up becoming a priest. That's an insane thought. At the age of 18, Hitler was on his own and flat broke, unable to get into the School of Arts or Architecture because he did not have the secondary school credentials. And this is where we hear that, oh, if only he got accepted into art school. He was not accepted into a university for arts and architecture. And that's where things began to change. Because at the same time, in 1914, when he was rejected from school, the First World War broke out. Hitler enlisted, even though he was an Austrian citizen, he was able to fight with German forces, likely by accident, and following an injury that took place in the war, he returned home from the war in 1917. I can only assume that the hard upbringing that Hitler had, combined with the war, Hitler described his role in World War I as the greatest of all experiences. And I can only assume that this is really the first time he felt a sense of purpose in his relatively tumultuous life so far. And I don't think it would be inaccurate to say that this, in the following years, would really spark what Hitler would end up becoming. After World War I was over, Hitler was looking for job opportunities and was actually appointed as an intelligence agent to influence and infiltrate the German Workers' Party. This was Hitler's official introduction into politics. And it only took from 1919 to 1933 for Hitler to rise through the ranks and go from a newly appointed intelligence agent to becoming the official dictator with a totalitarian regime within Germany. Throughout this totalitarian control from 1933 to 1945, Hitler committed more war crimes and human rights violations than you could possibly imagine, with the most notable of which being the Holocaust. But in 1945, his reign of terror and genocide was coming to a close, which brings us to late April 1945 in a bunker in Berlin. Hitler got word that Soviet troops were not only approaching Berlin quickly, but surrounding Berlin, and he had no other option than to go underground. While underground, he still tried to command what he could, although it was obvious that his people were no longer listening. And some of his most high-ranking officials behind his back were trying to negotiate a surrender, when all Hitler wanted was people to fight to the very death. He wanted no expense spared when it came to trying to get out of the situation, even though at this point, he knew it was hopeless. Hitler had gotten word that the Soviets had entered Berlin and that there was absolutely no chance of him surviving. He decided, like the egomaniac that he was, that he wouldn't let anybody else take him out or even imprison him or anything of the sort. So while in the bunker with his brand new bride that he also married in the bunker, Hitler used a pew-pew to scratch his head. And I do apologize for the censorship, but I really have bills to pay. Following Hitler doing that, his wife, Eva Braun, took a pill that made her not feel so good, and the two were no longer around. But it doesn't end there, because following Hitler's instructions, Hitler didn't even want his dead body to be captured by the Soviets. So following his orders, some of Hitler's helpers collected his and Eva's bodies and burned them and then hid the ashes. Although the burned remains were eventually found by the Soviets, and dental records did confirm that these burnt remains belonged to Hitler. And it was then where the hellish, nightmarish Nazi regime was officially concluded. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. And I also really hope this video doesn't get demonetized, because the video about bad people that did good things did. Regardless, if you're still hungry for some very interesting historical facts, check out the video on screen right now. It's a video about declassified FBI documents you're not supposed to know about. And that video is exactly what it sounds like. And I can tell you now, it's crazy and worth the watch. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. And as always, trust me, bro.